Hey, this is Martin Brennand from Manager Systems, and today we're going to be looking at how to use a calibration clip when your current clip that you're working with doesn't have enough information to define the lens. Okay, so here we have some bridge footage, and we can see that there's a couple of lines we can work with to help define this lens, but there's not really enough information here to work with. This is a 50mm lens on a DSLR that we're using, and you can see that although we've got some nice straights to work with, they're not really warped all that much because a lot of the warp that you see in a 50mm lens comes towards the edges of the shot, and we can't really see a lot to work with here. So how do we go about defining this curve of the lens when we don't have enough information? For this, we can use what's called the calibration clip. Now, by default, your calibration clip is actually your base clip. It's defined as your input clip, which is what is going to be worked on when you're doing your lens operations, and the calibration clip, which is what you use to define the lens within the shot. And by default, these are set to exactly the same value. So what we can do instead is import a different clip that has enough information for us to define the lens with. So what I'm going to do is import my own clip now and use a grid so I can help define this lens. So here I've got a grid, I'm going to click open, and we just leave all the settings as they are and just import. So now we've got our calibration clip set to this clip. We can go up and view that clip from our view panel. And we can see here that we've got a grid shot that was shot with the same lens that we used as the bridge clip. So I'm just going to drag through here and try and find a good position on the grid to define my lens with. And about here looks good. Now, it's not necessary to use a grid for your calibration clip, but it can help a lot because you can really start to see the warp that goes on in the lens. You can see here, for example, that we've got a very distinct warp coming down the side of this grid down here, and as well as along the base around here. But if you haven't shot a grid or you don't have it available, you can always try and find a clip that at least has straight lines in the shot, say like buildings or windows, so that you can actually see any of that subtle warp that's going on. Now, because I am using a grid, I am going to do a couple more steps just to really define the warp of this lens. So first of all, what I'm going to do is use the Locate Lines tool to find all the lines in the scene. Now, obviously, in this particular shot, it's very, very simple, and that's kind of the point of using a calibration grid. It's very, very easy to define lines and get the warp for the shot. Now, the advantage of using a grid is that you can actually define the lens a lot more strongly by selecting as many lines as possible without sort of overdoing it. Now, I'm not going to go and select every single line in this one because we can kind of see it's a simple barrel distortion and there's no weird warp going on. But I will be using the equidistant lines function down here, which will tell Mocha that I'm using a grid and to treat the lines as though they're equally distant apart. And this just helps reinforce the calibration of the lens by sort of forcing a uniform grid on our calculation. So just to reiterate how you define lines, we just click this button down here called New Line, or we can press the N key, which will also do the same thing as pressing the button, and then we just need to go ahead and start joining up lines all the way along that we think should be one straight line. So it's a series of broken lines that are being connected together with my clicks that are defining this longer line here and telling Mocha that this line should be straight. So I'm going to go ahead and now build up a series of lines to really define this whole lens, but I'm going to speed it up so that you don't have to watch me clicking sort of 100 times. So grid calibration does take a little bit longer to set up, but once you've got it, it's sort of locked in. If you've got a sort of more easy lens to work with, you could actually just go ahead and just go around the edges, and that would probably still define the lens pretty well. But I want to be absolutely sure that my lens is correct, so I'm going to do every second line and define a grid of lines to work with the calibration. Okay, so that's the horizontal lines done now, and I've done them two apart. And so now I'm going to define the vertical lines, and I'm going to start from this edge just so I make sure I get this nicely defined curve over here first. So I'll come back when we've done all these. Okay, now that we've got our lines defined, we can go ahead and start doing our calibration. So for this, we choose one parameter distortion because we're working with a barrel distortion. We could possibly use tube parameter distortion as well if we want to be sure, but in this case, let's just go with one parameter. Now, because I've defined my equally distant lines apart, I'm going to choose equidistant lines just to tell Mocha that's what it is. And then we can just go ahead and click Calibrate. So you can see immediately that these lines have started to curve inwards a little bit, and if I just zoom out a little bit, we can see the same going on here. So if I turn on my grid, we can also see that very subtle curve going on with this lens. So if I now go back to my original clip, and let's just zoom in a little bit, I can start to define the warp of this lens with the calibration clip that I've done. So in Mocha Pro here, I can either choose to render this flat, and we'll flatten that out, and we can look at the difference between those. So if I go back and turn off my grid for a second, we can see how that warp is being changed by that calibration. But we can also then choose to export this lens data out to, say, the Mocha Lens for After Effects plugin, or render it out as a distortion map clip, such as an ST map for, say, Nuke, or the displacement maps in Fusion. Or we can choose to now use our tracking data to export curved information into our shots by exporting out corner pins to After Effects or Nuke, or even just using the insert module inside Mocha Pro and using this curved information to make sure that our inserts are correct in the shot. So that's a quick overview of how to use calibration clips and calibration grids inside Mocha Pro and Mocha AE 3.1. For more information and tutorials on the lens module or any of the features inside Mocha Pro and Mocha AE, go to the website at imagineersystems.com. You can also ask questions on the forum at forum.imagineersystems.com or go to the Facebook page at facebook.com/imagineersystems.